Cool. I assume I'm audible. I would like POIs in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 4 arguments from opening government. 1, efficacy, how people change their opinions. Thirdly, on political incentives. And fourthly, on companies. 2 pieces of framing. Firstly, I don't think we're going to kill people. 2 reasons as to why this is the case. 1, you probably fear backlash specifically as a consequence of killing people, and therefore are not likely inclined to do this. But 2, you often care about saving the planet. So to some extent, those individuals care about saving the planet to prevent other people dying. So I do not think they will do that. I think if they block a road, they will let an ambulance by, or if they say blow up a pipeline, they're not going to do it if someone is there. 2, why is the status quo insufficient and terrible on their side? I would note we're happy to do all of the protesting, all of the leaflet passing that OO and OCO may argue for, but in the moment it is insufficient and we will amplify the efficacy of it. Why is it? Firstly, there's fatigue from protesters where they believe that the ability to actually meaningfully change the decisions that people make due to things like COVID preventing you being able to go outside and do a lot of protesting. 2, you have limited leverage over companies because maybe you do not have enough of a market share to convince them to change or that it is profitable for them to do so. And thirdly, you may not be getting any results because political actors are unwilling to compromise, particularly in the context of where rising oil gases exist and they want to give more power towards those environmental companies. Therefore, we're going to create all of that leverage. Firstly, on efficacy, I would note the perception of this. And I want to do preemptive weighing here. We may do this once or twice a year. It is a toolbox and a toolkit. But what I mean by that is often need to trade off in every single instance that never doing this is an inherently bad thing. And therefore, the problem here is that we may get 1 or 2 changes, but that means that it's incredibly efficacious. Why is perception incredibly important here? You never know what the environmental movement will do next when they are radical. You further next action, so you're likely to adjust and preemptively change your policies without any action being required of the environmental movement. Secondly, you never actually know, specifically as a consequence of that, where they will be next, what they are likely to target next. And thirdly, they are often decentralized. So having information over where the next protest is, where the next pipeline is nothing you can ever access until it is there, and you can only be reactionary to it. What this means, though, is that these individuals have an incentive to create better relationships with the environmental movement, but also to reenact those policies to prevent all of the harms I'm about to outline. And therefore, what that means is the trade-off isn't that you have to blow up every fucking pipeline, but rather that you do it once or twice, and that creates leverage and perception. First argument, why do people respond to this incredibly well? I would note the media coverage is likely to be overwhelming in the context of this, as we saw when Extinction Rebellion did it frequently in the context of, say, London. Why is this the case that you get media coverage? Firstly, it affects the daily lives of everyone. I mean, in the context of a road is blocked and you cannot get to work or you're delayed in the context of this. 2, in some cases, it may be visceral. It may be that a pipeline was blown up and you see an explosion and you go, holy shit, that's incredibly intense and incredibly unexpected within your life that does not see many explosions. And the reason that this is likely to be good coverage, and irrespective of not, it allows you to have information where parents and children can discuss it, and the children who have maybe learned more about the environmental movement can point out to their older parents why it is important, but that conversation is then spurred by the parents. 3 reasons why it's good. Firstly, you interview people. You specifically are able to refine your message as the environmental movement because that media company wants to understand your motives and explain it to the consumer base, and therefore they're likely to engage with you. 2, there's likely to be debates as to whether this policy is good or bad between the environmental movement and other individuals. Well, therefore, you're able to use your specialized knowledge and convey it to individuals to be able to convince them. Thirdly, you're likely to have a balanced opinion because if you're a news company and you want to drag it out, the direct incentive for you is to give both sides so that discussion can go on for longer, and therefore individuals are more informed and have more ability to act upon the environmental movement, understand their motives, be more inclined to support them. Often may say that, you specifically may react really badly. The problem is that you see them as ideological. They're literally willing to sacrifice their lives by sitting in the middle of the road, be willing to go to jail if they blow up a pipeline. All of these things you see as an individual dedicating their life to it. So you might have an initial response of anger or annoyance, but you realize that the retaliation will mean that these individuals believe they are justified in their actions and are likely and inclined to double down upon those actions, and therefore likely to actually raise the scale of the harm upon you. This is a perception that you have, and therefore, rather than being retaliatory or discriminate against them or backlash, you rather are more inclined to do the following. 1, seek out information to be able to communicate with these individuals and understand and empathize with them in order to prevent them doing as many harms to you. 2, you're likely to advocate for politicians to actually give in to them and give them what they want, specifically because it would make your daily quality of life better because you can get to work easier or it does not delay you. All of these things that mean you get significantly better political capital and ability to implement policies with limited trade-offs in this debate. Before I go on, closing opposition.
Yeah, do you think that the terrorist attacks that Islamic State conducted in London did wonders for Islamophobia in the country?
No, but the difference is that they viewed them as the other, not individuals that literally live within these cities, specifically often being able to relate to them. But also, like, crucially, the media coverage never says that they are terrorists when it is an environmental movement, because it's something that they're trying to benefit those people rather than an external ideological thing outside of them. Third point is substantive: economic harm on political. This prevents the public annoyance with protesters. Therefore, politicians are likely to do the following things. One, preemptively adjust the policy to ensure that these individuals are likely to not actually act upon them, so that you can have a chilling effect on their ability to act and therefore not have as much frustration with you and reduce your political support. Secondly, you want to reduce the economic damage. That is that if there's protesters blocking the road and individuals aren't able to go to work, that reduces your ability to do things like collect tax, implement policies that may directly affect your support. Thirdly, you're likely to create information or relationships with these protesters to ensure that you have a mutually beneficial relationship, so they don't actually screw you over, or at least are more willing to compromise or negotiate. The impact of this is you probably get better environmental policies in the form of subsidies and the form of preventing the dumping waste or huge water spoiling that literally will kill millions of people because the water becomes infected by companies like Nestle. Regulate dumping where toxic waste goes into water sources that individuals are not able to survive, or creating better air quality within cities that massively affects the quality of life of individuals in their daily life and how they interact with that city, and often leads to things like cancer. That means individuals often have a worse quality of life. The fourth thing is that why businesses change their behavior. Firstly, the cost of rebuilding a pipe is likely to be significantly higher. All of the materials you have to get in, all of the business you otherwise could have done with it, directly trades off against the fact that you could implement a policy that makes your company better. Two, competition. Here's the thing, right? If you think that these environmental movements are likely to bomb the shit out of your pipeline, there's a competition incentive. I don't want to be as bad as my competitor because I fear being bombed and have to take the cost. But in the status quo, the problem is that I need to be worse than my competitor to ensure that I have a profit margin incentive. And what that means is you radically shift the incentives of those companies to not do the toxic dump wasting, but rather be less toxic in their implementation of that, and specifically allow those policies to be implemented far better without any need for action. For all of those reasons, never been prouder to propose.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the next speaker, the leader of the opposition. You're here.
Thanks. First up my speech, I just want to do a shout out to Dan Spackler, not only being an amazing spar partner, but also helping us with case filing. Thanks, Dan. By the way, PY is only in the chat. I found like visual ones and people saying stuff very distracting. And by the way, you can call me also Peter in the debate. That's easier. That hasn't been said yet. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think that the environment movement in the current status quo is very big, and we think that at the moment you're going to try to become more of a terrorist organization, you're going to harm this. Why is the environmental big? 4 reasons. Firstly, know that there's a palpable change in climate change. Right? We see there's often now heat wave within Europe, but also within Africa. We see there's a rising levels of the sea, and therefore also more flooding happening. We therefore see people see more the need of it. But secondly, we also see that there's just an increase of green capitalism, where more corporations are trying to promote themselves as specifically green and invest in green alternatives to become more palpable to the general public. But thirdly, we say also that the mainstream politics has become just way more green in the general. I see much more green parties, such as in the Netherlands and Germany, just winning higher elections and getting more into coalitions to be able to fight for them, but also even within the European Union. And fourthly, we say that social movements, the social movement has just become more palpable on social media as well, with the fact that there are going to be more role models, as we see with Thunberg, as we see the fact that people now also just make sustainability options possible and showing like YouTube clips about how you can get like green alternatives rather than just going for fast fashion, for example. We therefore say at the moment you're going to do this, you're going to have like firstly an opportunity cost, right? Know that you're at the moment you're going to do this, you're going to spend time, effort, and manpower to do this in the first place. Therefore, we'd say much focus on the alternative. We also say you're going to be mutually exclusive on 2 other fronts. Firstly, know that corporations are less likely to actually work with you. I think in status quo, corporations are willing to virtue signal with you by actually, for example, discussing alternatives within green tech, for example. But also, secondly, you're just much more likely to get green ratings and more PR stunt, right? Then opening government says, you'll just work with the environmental movement. Firstly, know that the environmental environmental movement is not just one movement, but actually fraction. That means even if you with one fraction help certain people and like make a conclusion like, oh, this is how we're going to change, it doesn't mean that every single green fraction is going to agree with you and still not pump you. But secondly, we also say you're much more likely as a company to, instead of like working with them, with terrorists, you're much more likely to go for hiring more guards and just having more protection of your pipeline. Being more brutal at the moment, they're going to be protests because you see every possible protest as now going to be a violent one. We therefore say you're much more likely to actually crack down on them because you also don't want to like feel like other people are going to running your company for you, and you want to show to your investors you're the one going to be running them, and you're not going to be like majorly susceptible by any violence by any small group who's going to do against you. We also say in the media attention, mainstream media just will simply not platform you as you'll be seen as too extreme, right? Because we think that for opening opposition to say opening government say like, you'll just do this twice or something. No, eco-terrorists exist on the arse of the house as well. They do it twice a year. It's not fair for you to say like, we do it twice a year, but also just note by the info slide, it's about doing this more, right? It's about doing more of these actions. You can just like soft frame this and talk about this. It's not in spirit of the motion. So we say you're much less likely to platform you. But also note that at the moment the media is going to discuss this, they're going to frame the discussion, right? They're going to show the big explosion. They're going to show who lost their job, but also note it's just most likely impossible for you to actually make sure at the moment you're going to have like an explosion or blocked roads that actually ambulances will get through. It's impossible for you to know that every individual is going to cooperate with you or that there's no people on the ground at that moment. Meaning that at the moment, for example, someone gets tinnitus or somebody's arm is broken because of the effect of the explosion, you're still going to get fucked on there's the house because the media is going to show this. You're much likely to be platform and not going to show this out. But also note that the legitimacy of your movement is becomes much more harder to prove, right? Because you're also doing something outside of what is normally seen as normal and also against the law, right? Blocking roads is oftentimes illegal. Exploding private property is illegal. Therefore, you're also hiring your burden for yourself while also not being platformed. Therefore, good for you. We also show you're much likely to have individuals buy into you for three major reasons. Firstly, note that this often directly harms individuals, right? It's the most proximate to you. As the roads being blocked and you blowing up the pipeline creates like a huge cabal. We just say that at the moment they're going to say like, this might be like a first reaction for you in the first place. We say like, sure, but we think that people aren't just always kind of like emotionally mature to only like focus on this on the long term, right? You're going to be like, you blocked my road. Now I was unable to, for example, like go to my grandparents when they were dying in the hospital. They're much more likely to become more emotional and more angry at you and see you as illegitimate, whereas they feel like the alternative corporations might just actually like have PR, like, we actually create jobs, we don't do these extreme things, we actually are constructive towards society. Therefore, you're much more likely to actually have people go out in the first place. But secondly, also know that in general, they're much more likely to relate things to the things that are most proximate to them. E.g., you are the one that hit me, even you had a good reason because somebody else did it, told you to. I'm going to be angry at you because you were the one who still did it to me. Therefore, we say that people oftentimes, for that reason, hold the person who does something bad accountable rather than the reason for it. We also say it's much more difficult to get protesters on the ears of the house as well, right? Because you're going to, there's a chance for you to give up your liberty, right? You're much more likely to go to prison. You're much more likely to have violent police protest against you because they want to like clear the road. Therefore, you're much less likely to have opt-in for the environmental movement themselves becoming less effective in the first place. I'll take closing if they have one. Shame, OG.
So the problem with all of this is that maybe they have more political support in the West, but when literally water is being dumped into with toxic waste and millions of people are suffering in developing nations, I do not know why there's any change at all.
Okay, in developing nations, this problem can be much worse, right? Because oftentimes the people have an underdeveloped economy where there's a lack of jobs and job opportunities. At the moment, you're going to blow these corporations. They're going to say, we're not going to move to your country. We're going to go away, or basically going to unable to do these things effectively and therefore create more jobs. Therefore, you're also just going to get more backlash specifically in this developing country. You think this is not going to be good. So why are you also going to get less political buy-in? Firstly, note that left-leaning and Green parties is much more difficult to actually engage with you as an environmental movement and see you as legitimate. Firstly, note that just people get angry, and therefore you get much likely to have backlash on social media, which means that oftentimes these parties are now going to actively distance you from you. But secondly, also note that other parties are less likely to want to work with you because now you're seen with governmental movement, which is willing to blow up private property of individuals or just fight against the constitution. We know also, secondly, specifically centrists are less likely to do this because they have a status quo bias and tend to want to have more like peaceful things. Therefore, at the moment, you're going to have these active or these forms of like violence, they're less likely to want to engage with you as well or want to work with you within the political sphere. We think like more maybe right-leaning governments are also going to be like in the status quo, are at least willing to work with you, are willing to work with left-leaning green parties. However, they often have this frame of law and order. Therefore, at the moment you're going to do this, you're much more likely to have this right-leaning party instead of like working with you to go like, no, we should fight these protesters by actively placing more guards. You're going to have more SWAT teams at the moment. You're going to have protests. You're much more likely to have more drastic measures, meaning that not only you get less protesters, but you're also going to have less legitimacy because now you're going to have an active government trying to actively fight against the protest that you're going to do. Therefore, you also just gain none of the benefits that OG talks about. But we also say that politicians on our side is going to actually work with you. Firstly, it creates the legitimacy of the movements, creating more and also note you're much more likely to create policy or funding of green startups, right? I know the government's going to say, well, lobbying is going to make this difficult, but note that politicians aren't susceptible to lobbying at the moment that a lot of people care about these things. As I explained in my first piece today, the first part they do. Firstly, note there's a multiple corporations they can get campaign funds from. Therefore, they're much more likely to also choose for green alternatives at the moment you're going to have lobbying. But also just the funding of campaigns does not lead to electoral gain. For example, Bloomberg had billions of dollars into his campaigns and didn't win. Therefore, they're more likely to listen to the general populace, which are able to actually vote for these green parties. Therefore, you get more funding, you get more buy into the political movement. All metrics OG wants to win on. You should vote OO.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Great. Can I check I can be heard?
Yep.
Perfect. Just 1 second. I'm getting my notes in order. Okay. I take PLIs in the chat. I'll take closing when I'm ready, but that will probably be after the 5th minute. Cool. Getting started then in 3, 2, 1. Panel 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I want to weigh off economic harm even in the developing world against the harms of climate change we're able to prevent. Secondly, I want to weigh on perception and why the harms that they talk about don't occur to the degree they care about. But even if they do, we get better policy change that is more important. Thirdly, then, I'm going to respond to what is left of the opening opposition case, noting I think we preemptively responded to most of it already, and it's already out of this debate. One on economic harm versus the harms of climate change. Look, I would not, I think, optically claim that there might be short-term economic harms if you bomb a pipeline, if you block a road, maybe people lose some level of job. But I would say on our side, we're able to say that when you do bomb a pipeline, that means that alternatives have to be built rather than using that oil pipeline, which means that in the long term, you are relying on less fossil fuel energy. That also means that there is less dumping. That means that people don't have quality of like water. That means they're actually able to drink it and live in the long term. I think ultimately, parts of climate change that can be mitigated here are things like people dying in developing countries over time as the quality of water and basic necessities they have is fucked over by corporations who have no incentive to watch out for them in any meaningful sense. Cities going underwater as the temperature of the planet continues to rise because there's no incentive currently for corporations to mediate because there's no leverage from the environmental movement, even though we can prevent those kind of changes in the status quo, and things like COP26 have shown that there are goals we can reach that allow that to happen. But also I think millions of species that are not human that die due to extreme climate change changes like the Arctic melting or insects that die when the heat of certain places goes significantly higher. Meaning I think on 4 metrics, we're able to take this one. Firstly, I think it's ultimately unimportant in terms of economic harm. The first reason for this is that when this does happen, I think there's some level of economic stimulus in response. I.e., if a pipeline gets built up, you have to hire people to clean it up or to rebuild something else. But secondly, I think we're far more universal than them because the perception that there is risk leads to our benefits. We maybe do only have to have this happen twice a year. Maybe we have it happen more often, but the perception that the risk is going to happen is what creates all of our benefits. The policy change, corporations incentive change that preemptively change the kind of infrastructure they're reliant on. Their harms only happen when this occurs, which means we apply in significantly more cases. Secondly, though, we prevent and mitigate irreversible harms, whereas theirs are reversible and short term. Economic harms do not last a significant amount of time. People losing jobs is a very short period of time. Thirdly, I think it's a less intense harm on people's lives. I think people in the developing world who actually need water to be able to drink and actually live meaningful lives and not get sick and die on the ground from cancer or diseases that were preventable is significantly more important than someone not having a job in the developed world or somewhere where the pipeline was for a short period of time. And fourthly, on scale, I think millions of not just human lives who feel pain and can die can be helped on our side, but not on the opposition bench. Secondly, on perception, I think 2 reasons as to why it is unlikely perception will go down in the way that they talk about an opposition. Firstly, they're not seen as terrorists. And the reason for this is, firstly, as Jack says in the response to COPOI, they are not otherized to the same degree because the environmental movement is not made up of individuals who are other, who are like genuinely representing a group that is not represented much in the society you live in, and that is not one there's much ignorance towards. Even environmental movements existed before, there's some level of understanding towards them. People know that they are people like us, and there's not that level of ignorance that happens with things like the Islamic State. Secondly, though, as per our framing, they will not kill people. They will specifically not want to have that backlash, not want to harm people, because they are individuals with morals of their own who care about other people in their lives, and therefore you are not likely to have any of the same kind of media coverage and presentation of these people, because you don't hurt people to the same degree as actual terrorists ever would. Second response, though, the perception is only short-term anger, as Jack tells you, especially where, firstly, OO are right, and the area around them is already pro-environmental movement, i.e. people vote for green parties, people care for these people, they vote for certain policies. That means that there's no reason why that anger would outweigh your pre-existing relationship with them. This is something that you care about. Climate change is something that you believe is real, that we're taught in schools that is meaningful and has to be changed, but you haven't seen change on. Secondly, though, the media coverage giving balanced debates, because they have often policies that require them to do so, but also an incentive to cover the story in a way that won't lead to backlash for them in the long term, means that they are likely to have a longer debate about if these policies are efficacious and if they are worth it, if the policies that happen in response are worthwhile. Then those policies will also be debated. I think that means people will save their anger over time as they listen to different perspectives and learn more about the issue themselves. But thirdly, even if perception of the movement gets worse, we are willing to trade that off because it's fundamentally unimportant to the status quo. The environmental movements have failed to get meaningful policies in the status quo that meaningfully prevent climate change to any meaningful degree. The reason for this is because they have no leverage, and policies that would actually change this never get passed because governments don't have to listen to the environmental movement, because there is nothing they can do in response to governments which are significantly more powerful. That is not true on our side. When the threat of this happening, the risk it might happen, is enough to create that leverage and create better policy, which means that you get more windmills built, more government funding to renewable energy sources, less to fossil fuels, less importation of oil and gas. All of these things are beneficial to the people within those states who ultimately in the long term are less likely to face the harms of climate change, but also have a spin-off effects into this state of like the general benefits of more renewable energy, more renewable climate sources, less climate change within that state and other states, given that there is a global effect of how this plays off. I think this fundamentally is much more important than a movement being liked but not being efficacious. I think that's not important to this debate. Firstly, then, what they say is that the movements are big. Two responses. I would say, firstly, they might be big, but there are many other salient issues that exist in people's lives. They care about healthcare, they care about the taxes they pay, they care about their children's education policies, which is this is not a salient voting issue for most people. The tipping point for this to become important to people and then to actively care about climate change and environmental movement actively within their lives is this to be a threat that needs to require policies to ensure that the pipelines don't get blown up or that all of the other things the slide don't happen. But secondly, it's unclear why the areas where you were popular, the environmental movement would do this. If it is the case that the Green parties are really successful and they're passing really good policies, I don't know why it's the case the environmental movement would do it there. I would posit it's more likely that they would do it in states where they're not getting any movement and they're not efficacious, because that is where it is most strategic to do this. And given that the people who make up the environmental movement are not stupid, but are individuals who have brains and can think thoughts, it is likely that they are going to be strategic in their implementation of this and will only apply this when it's going to be relevant in the area that is likely to lead to positive change. I'll take the COPOI before moving on.
Yeah, if you block a road in London, can you explain the mechanistic link as to why Shell gets less extractive in the developing world? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
No, if you bomb Shell's pipeline, I'm going to get to this in response to why corporations change, the things they can do changes. Why is it that corporations will change in a meaningful sense? Firstly, I would not they say currently that you can't work with the movement because it's fractured. I think they're likely to work with localized wings, well-known activists or green politicians. But secondly, they say, they'll just hire more guards instead. This won't have a meaningful impact. Firstly, I think that's much more costly in the long term because for the reason that you never know where they're going to attack next. It's impossible to know what area they're going to go to. And given that they are likely to just go to where there are less guards, it is unclear how you protect every oil pipeline but continue to pay guards in a way that is significantly more difficult. But secondly, I think it's more likely you just build alternatives. You build that windmill, you shift to more renewable sources of energy or more renewable and less extractive things that won't be bombed by these individuals. Firstly, because I think you are a risk averse as a company and you've virtue signaled in the past, which creates pressure for you to do this. Secondly, because they shareholder pressure from individuals who don't want their stocks to go down in price, put pressure on you to be strategic in how you do this as a company, and therefore you're more likely to build those alternatives which are unlikely to get bombed, so that you, in the long term, you'd have to continue paying repair costs and all of these guards you don't care about. In green parties being less legit, I think firstly we show why the crackdown can't happen the way they talk about from right-wing governments, because you can never identify these decentralized movements. But secondly, I think preemptive policies are all that matter in this debate and the only thing that reach meaningful change. For all of those reasons, proud to propose.
Great, thanks very much. I'd like to welcome the DLO to round off the top half. Yeah, here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
opening government can't make up their minds. On one hand, they say the environmental movement has enough support that people won't backlash. And on the other hand, they say they don't have any support needed to get any policies done. I think Piotr gave you clear framing. Please shut down your camera, only POIs in chat. I think that most people aren't bleeding heart leftists. Those people who are really involved within the environmental movement are likely going to boycott corporations anyway. They're likely going to vote left anyway. Who we need to capture are the centrists, who kind of casually do care about climate change, recognize that it is happening, but it isn't the most proximate concern to them. I think Piotr explains really well how these people are going to be put off, but why they're essentially terrorist attacks on the industry that they value so much. What are the reasons why you're going to lose massive buy-in? First, on the economy. I know that we are ESL, but OG completely misunderstood our points. It is not that we weigh the economic impact over the environmental even. It is that we say that the people care about the economy more than about the environmental damages. Why? First of all, know that it is the most proximate to you. Environmental harms are in the long run for most people, like 20 years in the future. Whereas if inflation strikes now, you can't put food on your table. You see this as a bigger threat. That is why most Americans in polling say that inflation is a bigger issue than climate change. But also note that when a company is bombed, you see it as a symbolism of the economy being damaged, even if it isn't actually damaged. Why? Because companies employ people, especially manufacturing companies, give a lot of jobs to the working class, which is especially popular among the Marxist left, who are the most likely to ally to you. But also they contribute to the overall growth of the GDP. When your corporations are doing well, it is also a signal that your countries are doing well. You also buy their products, so you associate the products that you buy every day with these corporations. But fourthly, know that what they talk about is the fear. They say that corporations are likely going to change their behavior because they don't know which corporation is going to be struck next. This means that the backlash impact is like compounded all across the country, because even if you have a few attacks, all corporations will now say we could be next, and they will feed propaganda to the people that these terrorists could destroy every single company that you love. They could bring the economy to a standstill. That's why you're going to get massive long-term resentment for the people. This is especially true for developing countries. Why? Because for them, manufacturing industries are usually their claim to money, right? So you discover oil in a developing country, and then you quickly create infrastructure needed to extract the oil, and suddenly you can build an entire new city like it happened in Astana 20 years ago. So when these industries are targeted in developing countries, we'd like to get so much backlash because these industries then can expand rapidly and employ people who previously were completely out of jobs. So you're going to lose all of those poor people who otherwise would support you. But thirdly, you just get less investment in your developing country. If you know that any company might be bombed at any time, you're likely just going to move somewhere else where this isn't as prevalent. But also this gives resentment from the companies. They're much less likely to negotiate with you if you know that danger can't be anywhere else. What OG says to this, but they will fear like the pipeline being destroyed, so they will make some changes. First of all, what kind of changes? They can't negotiate with anyone, so they don't know what kind of tech they need to change in order to appease the terrorists. Since these people are radical, probably if you just change your infrastructure a bit, they will still bomb you. So you're likely not to change it at all because you don't know what you need to do. But also it's comparatively cheaper to buy guards than to completely destroy all of your existing infrastructure for the production and just create something entirely new. Probably the state will also subsidize those guards because of the law and order narrative that Twitter talks about. But let's talk about the media and why this will create huge backlash. First of all, when you have this discussion that OO talks about, you probably will not invite someone who is behind this because it is illegal. They're probably incognito, and the person itself is not going to be there. So you're probably going to invite an apologist, someone who's like, yes, we care about the environment, but this is obviously a bad act because people care about this. Know that people just care about their safety. So the perception of an explosion, even if it doesn't, is seen as something disruptive. If traffic is jammed in the middle of the city, you care because this affects your everyday life. You cannot commute to work. So the person who's on media is going to have to do apologetics for the environmental movement. Piotr gave you 4 reasons you're going to be invited on the media anyway, because you have a palatable temperature rise across Europe and Africa, because green capitalism is on the rise, because mainstream political figures like the Green Party in Germany are getting traction, because the social movements like Greta Thunberg. So we'll get on the media anyways, but on their side, you have to do apologetics. Also, you have to justify why this isn't a danger to the workers, to the Marxists, so leftist media is likely to attack you too. Why are you endangering the workers who are fueling our economy? You're going to have to justify yourself to the right wing. Why are you against the development of our economy as a whole? But also, just because of the fear they talk about, they're going to interrogate you as to why you're causing massive panic among the population where you don't know who is going to be next. Why are we going to be effective in the counterfactual? First of all, why is buy-in from the people most important? Even if OG marginally wins the clash, that some corporations change their technologies, I don't think this is sufficient to change, because when people support you, that is the way you actually get change for the climate change movement. Why? First of all, it is an electoral signal. If more people think that the movement is kind of okay, which Piotr thought it would, even though they're not hardline leftists, this means that more politicians are going to casually include some green policies in their agenda because it is electorally popular. When it becomes contentious, no centrist politician is going to risk it because it might be popular among the radicals, but they will receive so much opposition from the media, anti-lobbying, than just people on the streets, that it's better not to risk it. On the counterfactual, more parties will at least compromise for some bills. So you can have some regulation that forces companies to change to different behaviors. You can have subsidies and startups by the government to fund green. But also, people are more likely then to buy products that are kind of green. In the status quo, most people don't want to buy products that are made like in an eco-friendly way because they're a bit more expensive and it hurts your wallet. But you're guilt-tripped when you see the environmental movement as this benevolent movement. These people just want to save the environment. They are doing their best so that we don't suffer in the future. But when you don't see them as a threat, which this also means that corporations have less of an incentive to switch to producing eco-friendly food, for instance, because the fewer people will buy eco-friendly food. But finally, for corporations, I think corporations in the status quo have an incentive to greenwash themselves because they want to appear themselves as good and virtuous. They're more likely to invite your leaders when your leaders are seen as someone who is willing to cooperate with you. Corporations have an incentive already to switch to green tech because they can virtue signal as compared to other corporations that more people will buy your green products. You lose this ability to have this peaceful cooperation with your leaders when your leaders are associated with these attacks, even if they happen just once or twice a year. We are so proud to keep on the progress that the environmental movement is gaining in the political arena. We don't need them to be associated with terrorism. So proud to win from OO.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the Member of Government to kick off the back half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. I'm going to make two observations that I think take out the opening half. The first observation is that climate change is really, really bad and really, really time sensitive. And I want to be clear, this is not just an impacting argument in the sense of scale, it's an impacting argument in the sense of time sensitivity. Hundreds of thousands of people every single year are displaced by climate change, and that will grow exponentially within the future. Moreover, since climate change gets worse and worse over time, as Arctic ice sheets melt, they melt even more and more quickly. As they melt sufficient levels, they will start to release gases that grow the temperature of the world at a very, very fast rate. What this means is that realistically, it's not just that impact is large, it is that impact expands hugely every single year that we do not take action, that we realistically only have 5 to 10 years to get to carbon neutrality, that we need to invest massively in technologies that are alternative energies, that have grids, that do not rely just on some people thinking that climate change is a good thing, but require mass scale action from corporations and not having politicians block them. Okay, what does that look like in terms of extension? The first thing that I'm going to point out is just saying why corporations change and change their behavior and why that's most important. But the second thing to point out is that politicians simply do not do enough. I want to point out one final thing about the opening comparison, which is that opening opposition gives generic reasons as to why people care about the climate movement. But the important thing is that those are generic reasons as to why people care about climate movement and might think that climate change is real, but are not willing to take significant action on them. I think similarly, opening government doesn't fill in the links as to why politicians do specific things that are within their specific incentive to change particular policies. Why? Because the costs of climate change are not internalized in a way that makes the individual benefit calculus for any individual or politician right now matter matter that much. What we need to do is make it such that climate change is more expensive for the average individual and the average politician than it is to stand by. Because look, heat waves are riding across Europe. But we still see basically no action, because guess what? Heat waves for a few days a year that you don't think are that linked to climate change are less important to you than having lower oil prices to most people. We just say that that's a huge problem. Okay, first extension on how we hit the company. The basic economics of the worst companies in the world and why it is so important that we hit their pipelines and we hit their distribution chains. So this is BP, but this is also making sure that shipments from Zara are not consistently getting in such that they can sell huge amounts of cheap clothing that are contributing massively. Like 10% of the climate crisis right now comes from the over manufacturing in the fashion industry. We think that it's hugely important that we destroy the supply lines of these areas. Why? Because the vast majority of costs for these companies are fixed assets and infrastructure, not the variable. Oil itself is not actually that expensive. Producing clothing itself is not actually that expensive. What it is expensive is the drilling rigs. What is expensive is the pipeline. What is expensive is the cargo ships that are bringing clothes across, the factories, etc. When you need to rebuild those, you have huge, huge costs. What are the implications of this? When you destroy standing infrastructure, three things. One, insurance costs are really, really high because no one is willing to insure you in the future, which is again problematic because your assets at base are worth a whole lot of money. So you need to pay incredibly high infrastructure costs, and in many cases shut down because you simply cannot afford to insure that pipeline anymore, insure that factory anymore, insure that cargo ship anymore. Two, stranding assets is a massive cost. So for instance, when you break down a particular pipeline or a distribution facility, that means that purification and processing facilities are wasted. When you destroy a processing facility, that means multiple drilling rigs are left useless. That is effectively tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of each company's money that is left stranded every So you're just losing hundreds of billions of dollars. Thirdly, thin profit margins, because businesses operate on a huge number of sales when what they're trying to do is repay their fixed asset costs. What they have to do is sell a huge number of products. But when you disrupt the supply chain for even a few months, that means your profit projections are thrown completely out of whack, because guess what? People aren't going to use you as a supplier. They're not losing all of their liquid assets. By the way, they don't have that many liquid assets for the reason that I just gave. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, financiers go to alternative energy sources. The reason why they still want to invest in energy, even if they're moving their money away from oil, is because through inflation. Everyone needs to pay for energy. Energy is an input in every single product. So it's counter-cyclical. And when costs inflate, usually the cost inflation doesn't go toward the energy company's profits. It goes toward every other part of the market's profit. So a good stable investment and counter-cyclical for investors. So major investors do invest in energy still. What that means is that it goes in energy under our side of the house.
The destruction of large infrastructures is difficult for a decentralized movement, and reparations can be paid by governments and insurance companies, which get buy-in from the general populace who don't want to follow these alternatives, as the alternatives are promoted by extreme groups causing tons of explosions on oil rigs and oil pipelines.
Like, I just don't think that the government's willing to pay that much, which is what they haven't done in the status quo. Like, when has the government ever paid sufficient reparations that would take down BP and make energy in any part of the world cheaper on electric than oil? It's just not happening. But because like often they're subsidizing oil, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the second thing to point out, right, is that it's really, really easy to destroy these things because there's just a lot of it, right? Like, yes, OG kind of points this out, but the basic fact is like there were literally 3 climate activists that decided to bomb a pipeline and they made it happen because guess what? The pipeline's really fucking long. So I think that the point is that it's really easy to destroy these things. So when corporations invest in other energy sources, what is the importance? Because it drives down the cost of other energy sources. The reason why they're disadvantaged right now is because wind and solar doesn't have a low enough cost and it isn't easily distributable across the world. But technologies are improving rapidly such that can change, such that the cost of energy from electricity and wind can drop far below that of oil. What is the importance of that? And it's distributed far farther. One, it doesn't rely on politics at all. Politicians don't have to do anything. And guess what? Politicians usually just don't do that much because it's hard to get bills passed in any government across the world because usually governments are pretty split because usually governments are getting paid off. But secondly, it applies to industrializing countries as well. We agree that it's hard to get change in rapidly industrializing countries or countries that are non-democratic. But guess what? The reason why China is investing in clean energy right now is because they're starting to see the signs. We massively speed up that transition. The final thing that I want to point out is that their inaction is inaction. When people care about climate policy, they're still not willing to swing their votes on climate policy. Why? Because there are a ton of things that people vote on. And usually, for the reasons that OO gives, they vote on things like how high their oil prices are. But the thing is, oil prices can no longer be the determining factor for voting for a Republican. The reason why is because the oil rigs got bombed. There's no reason to give them subsidies anymore because no matter what, you're not going to get the cost down. Now people realize, number one, there's no reason to vote on that particular issue. Number two, the people who are going to vote on those issues or not care about climate anyway, still not going to vote for climate policy on your side of this house. Inaction is inaction. Number three, we get some people that are willing to swing to our side and vote for climate policy under our side of the house because we expose politicians, we pants them for taking profits from these oil companies, because we're able to manipulate the narrative. But more importantly, because we stop corporations from doing worse things. That is the easiest way to weigh this debate, because it's not about politics. It's about stopping the evil. Very happy to propose.
Thanks very much. I'd like to welcome the member of opposition.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? I'll take POIs then chat.
Yep.
Great. Much like my favourite Broadway play, I think that CG is having delusions of grandeur. Why do I think this? Because they go for two key claims. The first key claim that they go for is that corporations change because they are forced to internalise costs. Guess what? There are other ways of achieving this. For example, an emissions trading scheme that has proved to be popular all across Europe with carbon trading and carbon credits, a carbon tax like you have in many countries around the world. There are many ways in which you can make corporations internalise like the costs that are associated with oil production. And in fact, we've always done this for pollution, and the world is moving in the direction where people are endorsing that happening. You're more likely to get that policy in future. Because the mechanism that they choose is that, maybe you can just destroy a pipeline, maybe you can destroy it for Shell. That means that you can't get shipping, you can't get oil. I think that they lose out this debate very easily. Why? First point that I'm going to bring an extension that I literally can't believe that OO missed. People's lives just get worse, right? Like when you blow up an oil pipeline, people can't afford to do things like turn their lights on, like have electricity, like go to work if they're working from homes. They lose their jobs. But more so than they're losing their jobs, they simply cannot function in their day-to-day lives because the people that are blowing up these pipelines, these left-wing climate activists, aren't engineers and aren't scientists. They don't know what the actual impact of them blowing up X thing is, aside from the fact that it's associated with a corporation. Maybe you think that Shell is evil and that it should shift to biofuels, which it already is doing because of the very cost incentive that Matt already gave you. But given that that is true, and given that technology specifically develops at the rate that it is, that is to say that we do not have the infrastructure right now to put solar panels absolutely everywhere in the world and have them produce electricity because we're constrained by the size of batteries. We cannot do things like instantiate hydroelectricity or put windmills offshore in most countries because that infrastructure simply does not exist. It means that there's a huge time gap, and that time gap is important because when that pipeline gets blown up and OG tells you, they can just use a different one. No, they can't. And why can't they? Because another one doesn't exist. So it doesn't matter if they build one in 3 years or 5 years. The point is that there's no immediate replacement mechanism for the thing that people need. What does that mean? Costs go up massively. People can't afford things like rent. They can't afford things like food. They live a far worse life where the government is forced to do things like transfer benefits to them instead of investing in other programs, instead of investing in things like research and development, instead of investing in all the excellent things that we'd like them to do for social progress. Given that that is the case, I think that people's lives getting worse is the most immediate thing in this debate. Why? One, people are themselves alive. That is to say that you all prefer the people that are currently living to the people later because they're the people that are immediately experiencing the impacts, and they too didn't consent to this action happening. That is, they signed up to society maybe, but they didn't sign up to somebody blowing up electricity, and now are probably going to be very angry about the fact that their electricity supply has been cut off by the fact that these pipelines have been blown up. Two, I think this is really bad for industrializing countries. CJ just says that Zara is bad. I don't know. Zara employs a lot of people. Like, maybe sweatshops are bad, and maybe you think that you, as a Western person, like, can take an ethical position on that. But people genuinely need jobs in these countries. These industries have to exist for people to be employed where governments cannot support them and where they face death otherwise. So I actually think that they offer massive contribution. Also, maybe you think fast fashion is bad, but guess what? Some people are really poor, and that's all that they can afford. So I think it's ridiculous that the standard standard that CG goes to is like only by ethical fashion and things that come not from factories. Get over yourselves, please. Okay, so then what are our points of extension? I've already covered the first, which is that we think that it's going to be substantially worse for individuals. But secondly, why does it get worse for protest movements? And I want to be really, really clear here, right? Because this movement doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're going to make a very simple claim, which is that when the environmental movement does this, it is worse for two groups. One, the environmental movement itself. It's not for the reason that it is divided and fractured that OO gives you, but it's for the fact, and it's not because politicians won't speak to you, it is because that every time you do something as part of the environmental movement writ large, people associate you with the terrorism, meaning that they're more likely to do things like prevent you from protesting, prevent you from taking good climate actions, prevent you from promoting policy, and not be able to give you the opportunity to do so. That means that you get shut down even when you're unaffiliated with that. Two, they begin to make that association with people that are currently in power that are Greens politicians, meaning that they're less likely to get elected, less likely to be able to make the policies, which, by the way, neither OG nor CG tells you what they are. They just say, maybe you build a windmill. I don't know why you wouldn't do that on our side of the house. It seems like a pretty popular policy. It seems like we're constrained by technology, but not in the belief that climate change doesn't exist. Australia was ravaged by bushfires. I don't think anybody in the government now doesn't think that climate change is important, right? Given that that is true, I think that there are natural constraints to how quickly economies can transition from things like coal power to things like renewable energy, where those people cannot simply be moved into different industries because they want to be, because the reskilling and training takes a lot of time. That means that you're less likely to get funding from these protest movements, but also it sets a really dangerous precedent, which is that every time you want something to happen as a protest movement, you also have to be violent and radical in the thing that you do. I think this is a really bad precedent. One, just because it makes people's lives worse. Like, I think that people being fearful that their electricity is going to get cut off, that their jobs are going to be disturbed, and these are things that OG and CG have to accept because of these are the radical implications of the things that it do when you have people that are entirely untrained try and go for this. It means that you're less likely to get support for broadly left social movements. So this is not just the environmental movement. These are other rights movements that choose to be radical in the things that they do. This means that society is less likely to be supportive, and critically, the leftists that are so ethical on our side of the house become less ethical, become less inclined to support you, because the people who are vegan, who vote for the Greens, don't like things like terrorism, so they're probably less likely to vote for leftist politicians generally that continue that association happening. I'll take OG.
We prove why there is limited harm as this is used strategically as a perception tool. All of your alternative policies are reliant on our leverage. We uniquely stop dumping via competition that helps millions of people.
I don't think this makes any sense, right? It is just not the case that you change the perception. The media has a sensationalist incentive, which I also didn't say, to paint you as the worst possible person. Like, they're like, look, Extinction Rebellion laid down on the streets of Melbourne. People couldn't get to work. The economy lost $1 billion. That means that people can't do things like receive their welfare benefits. People can't do things like pay for rent or pay for food for their children and their families, things that they immediately care about. Given that that is true, it is just not the case that people are strategic about it or that the media paints you well. I think at the end of this debate, it's very clear that you get painted in that way as a terrorist. And that was why the POI I asked was so important. Because I asked, did Islamic State terrorism help with Islamophobia? And the reality is, it didn't. It absolutely didn't. Why not? Because people aren't necessarily receptive to radical movements. People do not like to interact with movements that they think are really far away from what they think is socially normal or socially acceptable. Given that that is true, you're less likely to get that on our side of the house. So, what do you believe in the end of this debate? One, I just think this is hugely unnecessary. I think the environmental movement is doing really good things in the status quo. It can only continue to do them as long as people are supportive of them and have the conditions materially able for them to be supported, where they do not have things like unstable regimes or governments because they have electricity insecurity that governments are supposed to make up for, but they are able to enshrine those governments in doing things like focusing on policy instead of redirecting that money necessarily elsewhere. Two, these people aren't specialists, so they're likely to make the most devastating change happen, which both OG and CG have to accept if they want to actually argue this motion. And three, it's just worse for broadly societally good motions, good ideas, which are likely to be constrained by the fact that people associate them with radicalism, and that's the assumption that they make, meaning that you're less likely to get societal progress and societal change writ large.
Thanks very much. I'd like to welcome the government whip. And actually, just before that, because I think you were away earlier on, just to check that you do indeed consent to being on the stream as well. I can't actually hear you, so if you did say something, I want to try that again. Yeah, so I can't hear the whip as well, but Anna, could you also mute yourself? Because I think I can hear the all-com room. Thank you. That's all right. We'll sort this out and we'll keep going. Yeah, CG, do you have like a headset plugged in or something?
Wait, Lilan can speak off my computer.
Okay, that sounds good. Lilan, why don't you just say a few words just to make sure we can indeed hear you, or one way or the other?
I think you have yours set up nicely, but you can kind of...
Can you hear me now? I assume there was echo before, so.
Yeah, I think that's all right. To everyone else, is that clear? Is that... Say a few more words, just talk for a bit.
So like blah blah blah, climate change, bad.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I think that's good. Apologies to all of you on the stream who might be hearing this. Thanks very much. Whenever you're ready, feel free to go ahead.
All right, sounds good. I think it is very difficult for all the reasons that all the teams have listed above, that you cannot change politics or change policy by changing people. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to first rebut OO, secondly CO, and then thirdly weigh on OG. Firstly on OO, the entire case is essentially that there is less buy-in and therefore there are more people who are going to be angry about politicians and companies on Gov and less people who are going to be angry on op, and therefore you have more buy-in and therefore more policy change. There are a couple of problems with this, right? The first thing is I'm going to first directly contest their claims that you can hurt family, you can hurt themselves, so therefore like people won't work with you as the environmental movement because you're radical and you blow up private property. I think the voting bloc is inherently becoming slightly more radical because young people are just more radical. They support things online. They tend to be more radical because they're inheriting a broken planet. The narrative is that they feel powerless against all these old people and the old guard. There's an advancement of social justice within the popular movements and the popular consciousness of the youth. So therefore there's like a likelihood that there isn't as much backlash among the most important voting bloc of the future. The second is, I think there also is, for all the reasons that OO listed themselves, already a lot of interest in climate change that is always going to be considered politically correct, and that is embedded in the consciousness and priorities of the people. And there are real trends and there are real people who are going to die from climate change and therefore some degree of care. But problem here, right? For OO, their links are all downstream of the capacity for you to change what people think and therefore change what politicians and corporations think. So since like people dislike the protesters, corporations and politicians don't work with them, media will be bad. So significant portion of OO's case is constructed like a chandelier. If you break this, you break their entire case. So here's what happens on CG and comparing with OO. We agree with OO that people do not care enough about anything, right? OO spends a lot of time explaining why it would be good if lots of voters support climate policy, but like 30 seconds combined on why they get enough of an increase in active supporters for climate change on their side that you get any policy change. In fact, we agree with most things that OO says, that people do not care enough and will never care enough to change policy, even if they think that this is politically correct. The LO says things like, they always think that inflation is more important than climate change. They think that it's more important that their grandmother gets healthcare, that people care about paying bills. CO says this themselves. But to add more things, it's also because there's a massive time trade-off to look and keep companies accountable, like Apple or whatever the other day, like published a report and they had a massively, like ridiculously small contribution to solving climate change, but most people just simply didn't care and didn't look into it. I think there's also an energy trade-off in terms of what you care about and what you focus on. I think the climate change also impacts developing countries more, or it impacts other parts of the country. So there's an empathy problem. There's an problem where the costs of climate change are not factored into your considerations because sometimes they don't actively affect your life. So all falls out because they're comparative. There's moderates will not hate you and all politicians and companies suddenly change policy, but this doesn't happen. It is extremely difficult to make people actively support climate change. So weighing as well, right? Their comparative versus ours. So even if they get moderates to eventually support policy change, this also, to be clear, response to CO, this takes years upon years for literal values of people to change. This takes time. And Matt gave you weighing that climate is an urgent issue. We have like 10, 15 years to do something, and we simply can't wait for fucking old people to realize that climate change is important and they pass certain policies. The second is just plausibility, right? It's very simple on our side. Changing companies, you bomb a pipeline, you vandalize it, the company is hurt, their financial backers and insurers are hurt. And so therefore they change what they do based on, the like existing threats. Simple, one link. They say, however, that the environmental movement first goes on protest. This secondly, then changes the values of hundreds of millions of people. And then thirdly, they vote in politicians. And then fourthly, these politicians decide whether to buy from bad companies, whether to change bad companies or pass certain regulations. There are like 4 links that are each not plausible or can be disproved in some form. Lastly, politics are implausible for like hundreds of reasons, right? One, voters who have influence are the ones who aren't affected because they live in rich countries, they have air conditioning, they can take vacations during heat waves and so on, or they just are wealthier. The second thing is most voters don't vote on climate policy, as OO says. They vote on what affects them the most directly as an individual, which are usually economic issues. This means that they always vote for gas subsidies, even if they're leftists. So for example, like France, like there were massive like yellow vest protests that forced Macron to lift all these existing regulations on gas, even though that he supported climate change. This happens in all countries, people get mad. The third thing is politicians also usually have a status quo bias. They're usually paid off by companies in some form. It's also very hard for politicians to pass policy that sticks because you always alternate between different parties, or you have to compromise, and therefore your policy is likely to be repealed in the future. Fourthly, politics always gets gridlocked because there are many parties that each want different things, and you have a lot of voters that we've already shown likely do not care about climate change. So it's hard to pass policy even if you get like enough people to care, because there are other people who don't want to pass this policy and they stop you within Congress or whatever. The fifth thing is like a revenue neutral carbon cap is fine, but it doesn't change the fact that coal and oil are currently the cheapest source of energy. So the cap is likely to be set very high because businesses lobby for a high cap, so it doesn't change anything. And lastly, even if you get policy change, it will take too fucking long. You wait until 2024 to implement a new piece of regulation. Even if you pass it now in 2022, you wait many, many more years and need to jump through like literally tons of bureaucracy for green subsidies to finally get paid out. By that point, it is too late. Before I go on, I'll take OO.
UNOG claimed that no legislative change will ever happen, but Green parties around the world are in coalitions of many governments. This isn't because people specifically vote for like a left-wing party.
I don't think parties have really done anything.
Plan.
Excuse me, I don't think that Green parties have done anything substantial in the past couple of years. There's a reason why we're suffering from massive climate change. There's a reason why they are smaller than the Conservative Party, why they're smaller by other dominant parties. They don't pass things, right? CO. A lot of what we said earlier responds to CO, because basically what CO says is essentially that their entire case is that people don't want uncomfortable lives, and therefore you'll be angry when you bomb a chain, right? But what they don't do is, if people's lives get worse, this means that they will not support emissions trading schemes because energy prices will increase. This means that there is no comparative on CO, because if you also don't want prices to increase, emissions trading will make prices increase. Macron will reinstitute oil subsidies, people get mad. I think the scale at which people's lives get worse is also very small, because most people do not see lives get worse. Impacts of oil are very regional. Most people will be fine. OG also says that this happens like twice a year. So electricity also finally becomes like a lot cheaper on our side because of investment in green tech. But even if like the worst case happens, like Zara and BP, I think we can die. Some people can be a little upset, but I think this is far less important than 100,000 people a year getting forced out of their homes by famines and being unable to live. I think they'd say something like consent, but I don't think that you consented to a lot of things, like a company destroying your planet or a grandchild maybe dying from a heat wave. So they don't respond to companies changing what they do either, or the heart of the CG case. But at the same time, their case works against themselves and means that they don't get a comparative and they don't get changed. They don't solve for anything. Finally, on OG loses out because they're assertive, because they don't prove their arguments. They say things like, your media coverage will be good because people see that you're ideological, they empathize with you. They say things like, the politicians will compromise as opposed to getting mad because they want to take taxes. But none of these are reasons why these happen. I think they don't contribute meaningfully to why they get any policy change. I think calls out from OO are correct. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And to round off the debate as a whole, I'd like to welcome the last speaker, the opposition whip.
POI is in the chat. Okay. The GovBench argument rests on this premise. If someone vandalizes my car or robs me, then instead of getting mad at them, I will reach out to them and try to figure out where I went wrong so it doesn't happen again. I think most people would rather just put them in jail. Broadly, the consequence that the entire GovBench does not engage with is that certainly there are multiple responses to violence. Like, the government cracks down on you and you get more public support for harsher crackdowns. Like, you do not get off scot-free. One, this is true because of OG's argument that you get so much media attention. Secondly, this is also true because if you buy CG's argument that this will be so significant, then the public will be more effective and get angrier at you. Thirdly, this is true because oftentimes, like, politicians have inextricable ties to corporations. So this means that the organizers who are doing the most work are also the ones who get the most jail time, and you just get more security. I don't understand why the only response that corporations or industries make is to completely change their infrastructure. And I also want to note that you need these specific people to be able to organize both your like eco-terrorist efforts and any other protests that you have. So I think this becomes self self-defeating, because then your efforts in the future will be less drastic, will be more scattered, and will be significantly less effective because you just shot yourself in the foot because all of your organizers are in jail. I think there are two viable options in this round. Either A, you blow up a pipeline and do nothing because now Shell just hires guards and it's harder to blow up now. Or B, you do blow up a pipeline, maybe they don't put up guards, and now you've just screwed over all of the people who need energy from that pipeline to survive. I'm going to deal with CG, then OG, then why we take out our opening. CG brings you one offensive argument, which is that corporations will change their behavior. One, I think the cost of like the oil industry or the fashion industry changing literally all of their infrastructure is significantly higher than like infrequent pipeline bombings. Certainly transition costs exist here that CG doesn't consider. Like Shell is not going to become Leaf overnight out now or whatever. So maybe they do make changes, but the changes are not the changes that you want. They are things like stronger pipelines or more security infrastructure or putting police along routes, not going green. This is why you get like bunkers in classrooms after mass shootings and not broad-scale gun reform. It's just much easier to not make the most severe changes, even if they might be more effective. I also think this means that there's a time difference, which means that even if it is entirely true that these corporations are going to completely change their infrastructure, this is something that happens very, very gradually. So I think this means that you both accrue the impacts that we talk about, that you directly harm people, and your own impacts about climate change. So I don't think you can do this quickly enough. So your argument about how politicians don't act quickly enough by like 2024 is also true for corporate change. Secondly, though, for other companies where the transition costs are easier, I think this is something that already exists. Like CG is incredibly uncomparative and does not explain why in the status quo these climate positive efforts are not happening. One, I think there are PR incentives to go green boycott products that are incredibly bad for the environment. Secondly, they're also directly threatened by climate change, because if their top level argument is true, that climate change is incredibly time sensitive and is going to kill us all very soon, then I think that they can assess future profits and have incentives to move towards renewable energy, renewable alternatives anyways. This is like already happening in the status quo. That's why corporations are the ones primarily investing in technologies like carbon capture and storage. Second argument they talk about is about like how policy change is unlikely. I actually don't think any of our arguments are contingent on this, so that's fine. OG now. Besides everything that I've said to CG, they have one separate argument about media coverage. I think firstly, media coverage just is not good. They literally tell you in PM that they'll talk about how a road is blocked and how you can't get to work. It seems like the interview coverage then will be about how all of these working class individuals showed up late to work that day and are upset now, instead of some in-depth analysis about environmentalism. I think that secondly, people on both sides of the political aisle just don't like violence. Like they will post images of a pipeline on fire, and that is a very visceral thing for viewers to see. Thirdly, I also just think you become desensitized to more media coverage. Like this is not necessarily a good thing. I think people then become used to these things because they constantly see it in the news and they end up just adapting. Note that if media coverage is not as fantastic as OG claims it to be, they cannot access any of their impacts about politicians like anymore. They also have an argument about corporations. I think I responded to this on CG. Before I move on, I'll take a point from opening.
So we prove the perception on actions of companies, the public, and politicians massively shift with benefits towards environmentalism, including CEOs, actors they care about. Nor do any of our bench do with any of our preemptive weighing as to which actor is the most important.
I think I just responded to that in like literally a second ago about how media coverage is bad, and also in all my responses as to why there are certainly other alternatives that are less cost heavy to these corporations. Okay. CEO, we give you two extensions. First, we say that it literally just harms people's lives. Like people cannot access can't assess the impacts of their actions. So the consequences of protesters doing this are incredibly severe. This means things like emergency services can't get to you. This means that you don't get electricity. This means that you can't afford things because you lost your jobs or you can't afford energy now. CEO says that they like strawman our argument by saying that we are talking about people getting angry. This is not the terminal impact. Like this is not an instrumental argument to talk about how you get like more political support or whatever. The argument is literally to say that by doing this, people's lives get immediately worse because they don't have like electricity in their homes. And I think that this is much more worse than what OG tells you. So why does this outweigh OG, and why is it above everything else in the round? I think that OG just broadly talks about buy-in, but first, I think that the impact from OG and actually all of opening half about policy change is incredibly unclear. Like it is unclear to me what the difference in policy changes you get on either side. Like OG and OO tell you that you get more policies passed, but it is not like extremely clear like what difference in policies you get. Like climate change is something that is already popular, that generally has bipartisan agreement, and I think maybe the degree of change is what is contested by political parties. But I think one, because scientific literature is just like incredibly robust, and secondly, people literally experience the effects of climate change daily, you're likely to get fairly similar levels of policy on either side. I think our extension is a more immediate impact and also more certain, and this also deals with op bench, which significantly more. Firstly, you ought to prefer people alive now over future generations because they actually experience these things. Like maybe they do experience some negative effects of climate change, but I think the immediate harm of not having electricity in your house is significantly worse. Secondly, this is just like more immediate and also more certain. It is unclear why climate change efforts will actually change the house. It is very clear why blowing up a pipeline is going to reduce energy access. The second thing we tell you then is that you just get bad precedent for other social movements. So even if everything I just said is not true, I think that the fact that this has gotten no engagement from CG is pretty telling, which is to say that leftist movements tend to form like coalitions and organizers share information with other organizations. So if you get, if like you get the idea from the environmentalist movement that radical activity is something that you ought to do, I think people then just become more fearful of social justice movements generally. Why does this take out OG again? I think more important is the precedent you set for other social movements that do not already in the status quo have bipartisan support. So movements like racial justice, for reproductive rights, etc. These are things that people do not have the same proximity to. So the opposition and backlash that you will get is much more severe because crucially, these are the movements that need more bipartisan support. This is also not just about policy, which engages with CG's argument. This is also about whether you get donations so you can support mutual aid projects and communities. I think it's pretty clear that CO takes the round.
Great, thank you very much. And again, to all speakers for a wonderful outround. Wish you all the best of luck. We will obviously announce the results on a later stage. See you all. Farewell.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you. Really quick thing. Is it okay to message you on Messenger after the results come out for feedback?
Yeah, of course. It's probably preferred, actually.
Awesome.